Thank you very much indeed for being here this lunchtime for this Prospect Fringe in association with the BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT. I'm an associate editor of Prospect magazine. My name is John Bernstein. Health and technology, how can data save lives? Lots of themes fall out of that question, not least, can it save lives? So we have Chi Onwurah, who is Shadow Business Minister and Shadow Minister for the DCMS, Department of Culture, Media and Sport. As well as being MP for Newcastle Central. We have Mike Fisher, who is Chief Clinical Information Officer, Royal Liverpool and Broad Green University, sitting next to Chi, between me and Chi. And we have Andy Kinnear, who is Director of Digital Transformation, NHS South. He is also Head of Health at the BCS. So that's the plan. We've also got a spare seat here. Diane Abbott is going to join us later. So, health and technology, how can data save lives? Chi.
So yes, it's a data world out there. Data makes so many of the new products and applications work, whether it's through targeted advertising or through location services, and that's in the private sector. It's also increasingly true in the public sector. But there is a difference, because the public sector delivers the services most precious to people, even those who have an iPhone. You know, what is most precious to people? Housing, safety, your health. I'm a huge believer in the progressive power of technology, and as Shadow Minister for the Digital Economy, we did a big review called Digital Government Technology for Everyone, about the power of digital to improve public services and championing the power of shared data. Can make better use of data, can not only reduce costs of public services, but it can make them more responsive, more personal, and empower the people who these public services are for, so that the old model of a remote, unresponsive state can be transformed into a personalised, empowering state. And in the NHS, data sharing could help millions, everyone, enabling early diagnosis, earlier interventions, better treatment, and more independent living. But, and this is just really, people must feel they're in control. Being targeted with cough medicine ads because you went to your doctor last week would be annoying. Having your mortgage application refused because the combination of your medical records and your Facebook likes indicated that to some algorithmic software that you would get diabetes earlier, for example, that would be traumatic. And the sort of databases that could come from health sharing would be a huge, juicy target for cyber criminals. And so that's why security has to be an absolute priority.
So I deal with data quite a lot in day-to-day clinical practice, and cardiology particularly is a subject in which there is a lot of data of all sorts. Now, the title of the session is How Can Data Save Lives? I'm going to modify that. Actually, data doesn't save lives, and certainly machines and computers don't save lives, because data has to be processed into knowledge. On the subject of where the public is on this issue at the moment, actually the public doesn't realise just to the extent to which data isn't shared. That's probably more the problem that we actually have on the ground. If you actually ask people in hospitals, the vast majority of people just assume that data is shared between all people who are looking after them. And the vast majority of people cannot believe, in fact, that I am not able, as a doctor in a hospital, to actually see their GP's record. The thing that really occupies my mind is that we have a traditional model of medicine which was essentially founded in the 18th and early 19th centuries, when the things that actually afflicted us were almost entirely infectious diseases. The truth is that actually the vast majority of illnesses that I see are nothing to do with that sort of model anymore. They're chronic diseases and they're long-term conditions. Now, people with that sort of problem actually do not do well in hospitals. If we're actually genuinely going to do anything about the health of the nation, we have actually got to stop herding people into disease palaces who actually have long-term conditions, because we tend to make them worse. And one of the ways in which you can do that is by being able to look after people in more, let's say, distributed care settings. This may be their home, it may be the modern version of the cottage hospital, it may be in their GP surgery with specialist input. And data and technology enables that process in a way that nothing that has ever gone before ever has. And that's where I think that we need to be really focusing at the moment.
I'm in my 26th year in the digital world of the NHS. I came into the NHS on the premise that data could save lives. That was kind of my starting point, and I've seen nothing to sway me from that in all the time I've been here. I completely accept what Mike's saying. Data per se doesn't save lives. It's the way that we process, analyse, utilise, turn it into knowledge, and then make decisions off the back of it. But fundamentally, clinicians are making day in, day out risk-based decisions, and they're making that on the information they've got in front of them. The more information that we can provide to them, the likelihood is that they'll make better and more sensible decisions in serving their patients. I mean, so one of the things I'm kind of famous for, I suppose, one of the things I'm most proud of is that we've run a project in Bristol where we've begun to join together patients' information across those multiple systems, so that actually we've now got a place where a doctor can look at one record, and it includes the GP record, it includes the out of hours, it includes the hospital record, it includes the mental health, and so on and so forth. One place, one system, one screen they can look at and do that. And I routinely talk with a GP colleague of mine who's actually an out of hours GP. So this is the guy that turns up in the middle of the night, or is on the phone at the other end in the middle of the night when people are having a kind of that dark moment in their life. Most of the rest of the NHS is closed for business at that point. And he has taught me through endless stories, frankly, of where he has made better decisions because of the access to the information he's got. So for me, the kind of question, can data save lives? The short answer is yes, and it does. I think the slightly longer answer is well, if that's the case, why is it taking us so long? And I think there's really fundamentally kind of three answers here. So the first one of those is rather boring but rather fundamental technical reasons. So until we get to a place where all of our data is digitised and is collected electronically and is collected in the kind of formats that allows us to share it across the system, then it's very difficult for us to leverage the value of that data. The second one is that is really around the way in which our health and care systems are organised on an organisational basis. There are a myriad of individual organisations operating under that NHS umbrella, and actually the way we manage and collect data has been very much driven by the needs of that organisational layer, and rarely is it actually shared beyond the walls. There's some tricky issues why that's the case. And then the third reason, and this goes back to what Chi was saying at the beginning, really, is that we've singly failed to truly empower our public around their own data. We just have not got to that place with health where it's actually possible for people to truly own and control their data in a way that will sort of transcend all of those organisational boundaries. So for me, those kind of three layers really are the challenge we're in at the moment. And actually, if there is a task for Mike and I and folks like us over the next 5 to 10 years, it's actually how do we break down those three areas to make sure we can leverage the value that data could bring.
As far as people are concerned, I think the really important, crucial difference that people see is sharing for the purposes of looking after them and sharing for other purposes. Now, there's a term called secondary use, which is used in the sort of this kind of information governance space. And secondary use means anything else other than for healthcare. The borders between healthcare and secondary use can get a bit blurry under certain circumstances. But I think, really, for the purposes of direct healthcare, the vast majority of people have absolutely no problem with their healthcare data being shared. There is many areas where we already accept, as a society, that there are places where our privacy can be breached for the greater good. And I think when that applies to one's own health and well-being, I suspect that it would not be such a big stretch to get the
It's on a
to
case
get
by
the
case
public-
basis.
Yeah, to accept that.
I think what we've got at the moment is often almost like kind of a reservoir of data existing that's not being utilised to realise its best value, often because of a nervousness or a caution or an unwillingness to push some of those boundaries on data use. And I think if we kind of open that up to the public to kind of take control of that, in a fully educated way, so they understand the benefits and the security levels and the control that will exist.
And presumably that's the key. That word education is the key, because it's, from what I'm hearing, it's about empowering the patient to then give permission to use the data, and then give the health professionals the empowerment to do the stuff they want to do.
And we're routinely doing that, aren't we, in all aspects of our lives? So we're routinely signing up to services, digital services, where we hand over control of the data. There's a dialogue in existence, a digital dialogue that exists with the public already around the use of their data. It can't be beyond the wit of man to say, well, we could extend that into the health space and have, a educated level of discussion with people about how their data is used for their benefits. If you start from a position of saying, would you agree that the NHS should share your data with a massive profit-making Swiss-based drugs company that's going to leverage value off that data to make as much money as it possibly can for its shareholders? Most people start to get a bit edgy and move towards the kind of no end of the continuum on that. Whereas if you actually said, would you be okay with the NHS sharing your data with some really top brain scientists in Cambridgeshire who are actually going to start researching cancer medications for the benefit of you, potentially your family, and your offspring in future generations? I think most people are swinging towards the yes end. Now, it's the same activity that's taking place in both cases. And it's actually, how do we, respect the need and the right of people to opt out of their data sharing, but also making sure they're doing it within the context of a really grown-up decision, as opposed to out of some emotive reaction to a poorly framed question in the first place.
Diane, I should introduce you formally. Diane Abbott, Shadow Secretary of State for Health, MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington.
I wanted to talk a bit about data security and the social effects of the rise of technology in NHS diagnostics. But I wanted to refer back to what Mike said about sharing data, and it already happened and it's not a big step. Actually, the instances in which he talked about sharing data were all instances in which there might be reason to believe a crime had been committed. So we do already share data in that context, but I believe it would be a big step forward to share, well, it would be a big step to share data in relation to health. I think it's a serious thing when you come to health data and who you share it with and what the safeguards are. Because the only way now for people to access the NHS is by booking an appointment with a GP, and demand on GPs is so high, I welcome using technology to save time for people willing to use the technology. In theory, particularly to someone like me that has their iPhone welded to their hand, it looks like a good idea. But we have to always be mindful that the majority of the people that use the services of the NHS on an ongoing basis are the elderly. And are we seriously saying that elderly people, rather than having an appointment with their GP, can talk to him on Skype? Characteristically, when you have someone sitting in front of you who wants to tell you about a problem, they start off telling you about problem A, and it's always, just as they're leaving, they tell you about problem B, which is actually the real problem. So what worries me about the use of technology and not having enough human interaction, it might hinder diagnosis rather than help it. I remain to be persuaded if more tech and more use of IT solutions for diagnosis and more tech to enable people to interact with their GP is going to help us diagnose some conditions earlier. So I suppose what I'm saying, yeah, health tech is empowering. It's empowering for people like me and my son. But for the bulk of people that go in through GPs' doors, week after week, month after month, you have to be very careful before assuming that more use of tech is the answer. And there are all sorts of issues around data security which we have to look at very carefully.
I want to get Mike and Andy's response to that. Mike, I'll come to you first. The instances that you cited in terms of the opt-in, opt-out were instances where there is a fear that a crime might have been committed. So they're very, very specific, and that's a world away from some of this other kind of sharing that we're talking about.
No, I think that's an entirely fair point. I think it does come down to this slightly arcane distinction between primary and secondary uses of data, really. So that's the distinction we've got to make, and I think it's really important that people understand that that distinction is being made, and it requires policy and it requires law in this area to enforce it. I think it's the purpose for which data is used that I think really matters to people.
Andy, let's get your views while we can, just briefly if you wouldn't mind. So this idea that actually that face-to-face thing is absolutely vital, and actually there are parts of society where this smartphone or Skype equivalent just isn't going to cut it.
So I don't disagree with that, and I think that is true, but I also think that once you've got past that point, you can get into some really interesting and exciting things. So I know, for example, Southampton Hospital, University Hospital Southampton, doing some really interesting work around personal digital records, patient-held records, patient looking after and collecting their own information, with men who've are recovering from prostate cancer. So very often some quite elderly gentlemen are doing this, and you're right, they have their initial contact, it's with a doctor, they get the whole face-to-face thing, they get the relationship, and after that, and then they're given an iPad by the hospital, and they help manage their own care through their iPad. So that personal contact initially to establish the kind of doctor-patient thing, you're very often right. I think it is hard to imagine that can't happen in a face-to-face way. But once you get beyond that place, you can start you're not dragging people from all over Hampshire to go down to Southampton for their appointments. This thing's being managed online, and nurse will ring them up.
So you're saying it's not an either or?
It's not an either or. I think it's a kind of, can you introduce some efficiencies into the system on behalf of on behalf of the system and the patient through the digital thing. But I do agree with you. I think that that fundamental human contact thing is where you establish trust and the repartee that goes on.
Well, it's been an interesting debate. I'll repeat my concerns about data protection, and I would stress that there will be people that if they know you are sharing their data, they will not want to talk to you about any mental health problems they have. They will not want to talk to you about whether or not they may be LGBT. They may not want to talk to you about conditions, there are communities in which cancer remains highly stigmatised. And it worries me that unless people have assurances about what you are doing with their data, they will tell their practitioners, whether they're GPs or consultants, they'll actually tell them less. There's clearly a role for tech going forward, and clearly there are processes like taking your own blood pressure every week and uploading it so somebody can review it, where it can work. But the notion that you have one consultation with your GP or your consultant, then you go off with your iPad, I think that rather devalues that ongoing personal contact and the importance of it. Given the nature of the patient profile we're looking at, we need to be careful about saying you see them once, you give them an iPad and they're good to go. It's a lot more complex than that.
Thank you all very much for your attention and your questions. Please thank the panel.